Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show on this lovely Thursday afternoon. We have a great one ahead. We are going to continue with our bubble watch throughout the different conferences in college basketball, beginning today's show with the Big 12, then going on into the ACC and concluding our bubble watch talk for the day with the Big 10. Then we get into the top 2025 NBA draft risers. Which three players do I consider as players to look out for in the next couple of months to see their draft stock either rise or plummet? And then we transition over to the world of baseball. We look at the top 5 MLB prospects heading into the 2025 season. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, that if you haven't done so already, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you want to keep up to date with all the content around not just my show, but the network as well and the other shows around it as well. But if you do want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider availing yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to better leave any opinions, any feedback, any input you may have throughout the show, because it just makes it that much better when you, our faithful audience, is contributing to it and is genuinely appreciated, as well as any tips or donations you might consider leaving if you feel so inclined as well. But without further ado, let's just jump right into today's show, starting off talking bubble watch. We got three very different conferences to discuss here in terms of the teams on the outside looking in currently, those with work to do, and those that are even locks potentially. And it all starts with the Big 12. Perhaps the deepest, most balanced conference right now in college basketball, but I don't necessarily know if it's the best or most talented. But I do think that several teams, nevertheless, have a chance to go on deep runs. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into the Big 12 Conference. Talk about some of the locks here, talk about some of the problems they may face, talk about some of the positives that they've come across throughout their runs, and then let's get into the guys looking to stay in the race for the tournament. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Starting off with the locks here now. Like I said, the Big 12 is a deep conference. It's battle-tested. These are teams waiting to break out in the NCAA tournament in a couple of weeks. And these are all teams highly capable of getting to at least the Elite Eight, not let alone the Final Four here. But I do think that each and every single one of the teams who are locks has some kind of issue to it, whether it be strength in one area and lacking in depth in another, or over-reliance on one specific individual player. I just think that the logjam of talent at the top of the conference needs to separate itself from other conferences' best teams come postseason time. And I'm not necessarily certain if they can do that. So let's talk about each and every single one of the locks already. Let's talk about the ones that are most concrete and I believe to have the best chance of making it to the Final Four. The Houston Cougars, very deep team, perhaps one of the best defensive teams in the country, if not the number one defensive team in the country. Built very well in terms of their front court depth with two guys up front in J1 Roberts and Javier Francis with experience. But the fact of the matter is, last year they had a much better point guard in Jamal Shead to lead them, and now they're relying on Oklahoma transfer Milos Ujan. And last year, Jamal Shead couldn't even get them to the Elite Eight. They crashed out in the Sweet 16. So can Milos Ujan help them in terms of giving them a little bit of a scoring pop in close games, because they have the defense to make it all the way, but they might need to outscore some of these opponents in other conferences to have a chance. And I don't necessarily know if Milos Ujan is the guy at the point guard position to do that. Then Iowa State has the most balanced team in the Big 12, both in terms of offense and defense. That wasn't the case last year, where they clearly relied on their defense to get them as far as they did. This year, they're a little bit more balanced. They're very potent, especially in terms of their fast break and transition abilities and getting out fast. I love Curtis Jones' leadership, perhaps the vocal leader of this team, and they have a guy in Joshua Jefferson who can get it done down low. But I do feel that, say if they face a Duke, an Auburn, and Alabama down the line, can they win in a shootout fashion? Can they match these high-powered offenses in the nitty-gritty moments of the NCAA tournament to advance even further? And I'm not sure. Then let's talk about the preseason number 1 in the AP poll, Kansas Wildcats. Definitely a little bit more disappointing than people would have expected them to be, but they still are a very deep team. Great inside-outside duo in DeJuan Harris and Hunter Dickinson, who potentially could have a fascinating tournament if he gets going. But I just don't think they've been consistent and efficient enough to guarantee that they can make a deep run in this year's tournament. And then both Arizona and Texas Tech, again, very experienced teams, but I think they might be a little bit too reliant on certain players in crunch time. For Arizona, it's Caleb Love. For Texas Tech, they are a little bit more balanced, but I don't necessarily know if a team led by a guy like Jacob Toppin can advance if he's the only one producing. I know they have Darian Williams as well, but it's too much pressure on those two players. And then for Arizona, Caleb Love, for them to carry these teams any further in the tournament than, say, the Sweet 16. So I can see some top teams in this conference make it far, potentially even to the Final Four. But I don't know if they have the talent, the depth, the offense, most importantly, because this is a highly defensive league, to break through and claim themselves the national champion. I just don't see it. But now let's get into the teams who should be in. And one of these teams could also be amongst the locks at this moment in time. They did just lose to Houston, though. And again, very similar to some of the teams who already have cemented themselves as firm locks, is the Baylor Bears. This Baylor Bears team has a tough strength of schedule, and they've done well against it. They have the 15th toughest strength of schedule nationally. They have a number 14 ranking in BPI, so all the rating systems like them as well. But I do feel they haven't shown up against elite opponents, especially against top 50 opponents where they're only 4-8. And this loss to Houston calls into question their abilities to compete against the elite opponents, not just in the Big 12, but around the NCAA this season. And I do think that in terms of the spectrum of teams who are either talented in one area and lacking in another, or over-reliance on important players, I think they fall in the latter camp. They rely on two freshmen, nevertheless, in VJ Edgecombe and Robert Wright III, and they brought in transfer to try and supplement them in Norchad Omeyer down low and Jeremy Roach as a supplementary guard. But I just don't know if they can put it all together like potentially some of the other teams in this loaded conference. So Baylor, while they're starting to become a little bit more lock territory, I do feel that they might be the weakest link on the locks in the Big 12. Then those with work to do are very interesting teams. Let's start off with BYU. They have lost 2 straight against fellow bubble candidates Arizona and Cincinnati. They did score a win over West Virginia, who we're going to talk about a little bit as well. I do think that they're starting to get in the conversation of at least having a fighter's chance of getting a top 10 seed in the NCAA tournament. They do rank 8th in net, and that spells like success in terms of getting into the tournament for a team that's expected to put in at least 7 to 8 teams, and they're a borderline top 30 BPI team, and they don't necessarily have as much depth as some of the top teams in the Big 12. They do have an exciting point guard from Europe, and Igor Domin, one of the best passers in college basketball this year. But ultimately, their goal is to navigate a tough schedule towards the end of the month. Kansas and Arizona coming up before in March. West Virginia again. and Iowa State are on the docket for them. So if they can navigate that tough schedule, chances are they'll start to become a bit more lock territory. And then West Virginia are a team that have dropped 7 of their past 10, trending downwards, and they rank 6th in the Big 12 in net. But I do feel like they can play themselves into the conversation. They're one of those teams that's sneakily more balanced than they look, and I think they're going to be more than the sum of their parts should they get into the tournament. Look out for this team down the stretch. They have a big game Saturday against Baylor, and another one coming up at the end of the month against Texas Tech. So if they can win and continue to win, get back into rhythm here, and really make a go of it, they could start trending into the should-be-in conversation. And then the one team that I'm not necessarily certain about, Cincinnati, they have a couple fascinating players. They're trending downwards in terms of trajectory. They're currently at 27% to make the tournament, and they have big, big games. And they can add a lot of wins above the bubble to their schedule, and they currently rank 36th in BPI, and they have a chance to skyrocket over those rankings if they win several of these games. They're at Iowa State Saturday, at West Virginia on the 19th. They're at home against Baylor February 25th, and they're at Houston March 1st. So if they can split or go above 500 in each of those games, they have a fighter's chance. But really, I'm looking at the top teams in the Big 12 to really try and make a go of it in the NCAA tournament. And I do think that Houston and Iowa State are the cream of the crop if you're looking for top contenders there. But we'll just about do it for the first segment here, because coming next, we're going to be looking at the ACC. Definitely a much weaker conference in the Big 12, but still a lot of top dogs to talk about within it. So we'll be right back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always to avail yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube if you feel so inclined, as well as our website gsmcpodcast.net to better contribute and interact with the shows a little bit more directly. You could also leave tips and donations as well as comments if you feel so inclined as well. And it's genuinely appreciated by all concerned, not just my show, but all other shows on the network, and it just makes them that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to them. But without further ado, let's jump right into our next Bubble Watch segment, talking about perhaps the weakest conference in college basketball, the weakest Power 4 conference, so to speak, in college basketball, the ACC. But at least they do have a very appealing team in the Duke Blue Devils, right? At least they have one team that a lot of people are going to hone in on in terms of having success in the NCAA tournament in Duke. But if you look at the depth of this conference, there were a lot of teams expected to make big leaps in the ACC this year that have just underperformed. There were a lot of talented players in the ACC, and a lot of teams were expected to be just as talented as the players on them. But for some reason, this conference has massively faltered in terms of producing any team outside of Duke could potentially make a deep run. Although Clemson is definitely an appealing team, they return a lot of players outside of, P.J. Hall from that Elite Eight run last year. And they do have a very impressive win at home over Duke on their resume. I don't know if lightning can strike twice. And then when you go down the list of teams, Wake Forest and North Carolina were certainly teams who before the season profiled like locks to make the NCAA tournament. North Carolina with a lot of experience, potential award candidate in R.J. Davis leading them. And then Wake Forest, another guy in Hunter Salas, who could have been in the conversation for the win award on a very talented Wake Forest team. Just underperformed all season long and now find themselves struggling to stay afloat in terms of the tournament picture. But without further ado, let's just talk about how all these teams are going to impact the field should they get in. And all those teams on the outside currently looking in can make an impact on the stretch for this conference. Because right now, this conference is not looking deep at all and really only looking to produce about 2 potentially elite teams and several teams who I think are going to underperform should they get in. So let's start about the locks. Let's talk about Duke, because Duke is what's selling the ACC right now. Without Duke, there's not really a team in this conference you can pinpoint and say, this team's making the run. This team's earning our conference money. This team is excitable, it's watchable, and most importantly, we feel like it's going to be the best dog in the race for our conference. And that this year is just Duke and only Duke, in my opinion. And I feel like, I can talk about Clemson as well pretty highly, but Duke is what's selling this conference. And it's Cooper Flagg, and it's Con Kneppel, and it's Commonwealth Walker, these 3 impressive freshmen. And it's not just them. It's the role players as well. Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster adding the experience. Malik Brown, another young guy, adding elite defense to this team. Sion James having big games here and there off the bench. Isaiah Evans adding a perimeter threat to the squad as well. So with all those pieces in place, Duke are the team in the ACC. So if this team comes up short, doesn't make it to at the very least, the Elite Eight, then this conference would have failed in terms of having success in this tournament, in my opinion, because Duke is their bell cow. They're going to ride it into the dirt for as long as possible. And they have to hope that this Duke team advances far in this tournament, or else there really is no one else. Let's talk about the other teams who could emerge here. Let's start off with Clemson, who before weren't necessarily a lock. They were ranked 73rd in, I believe, BPI, strength of schedule. They had a 10-4 record, though, against the top 100. And then with that win over Duke, probably cemented their status as a lock in this tournament. And I do like the complexion of this Clemson Tigers team, right? They lost P.J. Hall, who was the heart and soul of their team last year. The return elite guard Chase Hunter, and a really nice hybrid player in Ian Sheffield, who can play down low, shoot the 3, and then with the emergence of Victor Lockeen as their main big man, really have the complexion again of being an Elite 8 team. As Tap to Learn says, Louisville earned some love, we'll get to them. But this Clemson team, if I were to pick any team outside of Duke to make a deep run in this tournament, I would have to go with them. They return Ian Sheffield, they return Chase Hunter, and with Victor Lockeen stepping up, they have an elite core there. But about Louisville, they are more in the individual player realm with a guy of Chucky Hepburn's caliber, but they do have an easy remaining schedule, and I feel like they're going to be gliding into the NCAA tournament on a high. I don't necessarily know if this is a team I'm going to be buying into after the round of 32, if they advance that far even, because I don't see anyone outside of Chucky Hepburn on this team that can lift it a little bit. So I feel that Louisville are going to get into the tournament, maybe win a couple games. But I'm not expecting them to make as much noise as, say, a Duke team or potentially a Clemson team. But now let's get into how disappointing this conference has been in terms of producing talent and depth outside of Duke. The should-be-in category falls upon SMU. They have a good chance of getting in, and I really like this team as well. Very balanced. They're currently at 78% in terms of their status to get in. They have some tough games upcoming down the stretch. They have Wake Forest Saturday, and Clemson in a week's time. So if they win those games, they're almost certainly locks as well. And I really like the complexion of this roster. Johan Traore, I really like. Boopy Miller, the junior guard. A lot of talent on this roster that I can get behind, but not to the extent of, say, a Clemson Tigers team. Now let's get into the actual disappointment in terms of this ACC, because these two teams in the work to do category were expected to carry the load behind Duke this season. Maybe not one team over the other, but they kind of were equal in my mind in terms of how this conference would look should these teams have met expectations. Let's start off with Wake Forest, because right now their chances, however you see it, are either hanging by a thread or they have a chance to jump into the should-be-in range. And I feel like that loss to Florida State, where they blew a 16-point lead at home, is going to come back to bite them, because they don't necessarily have an elite strength of schedule remaining to catapult them into the tournament, in my opinion. They do face SMU, like I said, Saturday, but no one really scary outside of Duke in a couple weeks' time to really bolster their resume. Because right now, they're ranked 7th in the conference in net, and I feel like they have enough quad 1 wins to where you can be convinced that they should be in the tournament, and they should be in the should-be-in category. They've already beaten UNC and Pitt, two other ACC bubble teams, but I just feel like they haven't met expectations like they were talking about before the season for this team. And I know there's a lot of pressure on the one individual player who expected to carry this team in Hunter Salas, but I do feel that the fact that they're now hovering around the bubble is a little embarrassing, considering the fact that this was a team expected to be on the level of, at the very least, say a Clemson or a North Carolina right now. And I can't necessarily say that about them. But then let's talk about North Carolina, because I believe that this is the most disappointing team of all in the ACC. When you look at this North Carolina Tar Heels roster, yes, it's guard loaded, but it's experience. You have guys in Elliot Cadell, Seth Trimble, Ian Jackson, and above all, RJ Davis, who are all elite shot creators. But I think that the problem with North Carolina this season that a lot of people might have overlooked, including myself, is the loss of a guy like Armando Bacot. Like him or not, he's one of the most elite North Carolina centers in their history. It was the reason that when he was there, they were able to make deep runs in the NCAA tournament. Now they're relying on Drake Powell, who's not necessarily a fully developed player. And yes, he's expected to go in the lottery of this year's draft, but he's still a very rudimentary player in terms of his ball skills, in terms of how he attacks down low, and most importantly, for a high-profile team, he's not necessarily the center you would want to have weight placed on their shoulders for. And so that's why this North Carolina team just has so underwhelmed this season. And I feel like that's not necessarily something that we expected, but it's something we should have kind of been warned about with the profile of this team down low once Armando Bacot left them. And to make matters worse, they're only a borderline top 50 strength of record team. They have a 7-11 record against the BPI top 100. And they only have a couple more games left to bolster their profile as a contender to make the tournament. They go to FSU in 2 weeks' time, and then a couple of weeks down the road, they're up against Duke. They don't necessarily have any other teams in their schedule to bolster their resume outside of those two. But if they do beat Florida State, and they take care of business against the three teams they faced beforehand, then we might be talking here. But other than that, really down year for this conference, but look for Duke to be the bell cow for them in the NCAA tournament and potentially be the saving grace if they win the national championship. Let me know what you think about the ACC. Coming up next, we conclude our Bubble Watch talk for today with the Big Ten. Definitely a loaded conference in terms of how many teams could make the tournament, but will any of them do anything once they get there? Tune in and find out what I think after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we are finally ending our Bubble Watch talk, at least for today, with the Big Ten. Now, I really like the complexion of this conference, right? Because compared to the SEC, it's going to put in about an equal amount of teams. There's a lot of depth and, most importantly, experience in the Big Ten to rival all the SEC contenders. But my big question about the Big Ten is that out of all the locks, is there one true team that can emerge as a championship contender out of all the teams projected to make it? Because the Big Ten is all about putting teams into the tournament this year, all about producing tournament level teams. But are they championship level teams? Tune in and find out now. Because this Big Ten, right, is battle tested, all the teams beating each other up, but I feel like, in my mind's eye, if I'm the Big Ten, I do worry that even with all the talent, even with all the teams that we're putting into this tournament, I can't necessarily pinpoint one that separates from the pack, one to rival other conferences' best teams. But I do think that because of the depth of this conference, there could be a lot of teams that could separate from the pack come tournament time. But for now, it's a little bit of a mess in determining how real some of these teams are right now. But let's start off with the locks and then work our way down. And then we'll get into some of the disappointments, especially in the Big Ten, although there are very few. Now let's start off with the locks, because all these teams, right, and you can definitely say there's something similar about them to what we talked about with the Big 12, in that they could be over-reliant on one or two individual players, or they have depth somewhere but not enough elsewhere. But I do think that in terms of the Big 10, they're just a little bit above the Big 12, because I do think that experience will matter down the line for the Big 12, and they just have a little bit more of it to me. Let's talk about the top contenders here, starting off with the Purdue Boilermakers. They had a 7-game winning streak snapped by another team we're going to talk about in a short while in the Michigan Wolverines. But to me, this Purdue Boilermakers squad isn't necessarily the same as the one with Zach Edey in it, but they still have the talent there in the backcourt, especially with Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer, to get the job done. It's just about guys like Trey Kaufman-Renn and Camden Heide up front producing for you down low. But I do think that this team is sneakily balanced enough to at the very least make an Elite 8 run. But there do seem to be too many questions compared to when they had Zach Edey than there are now. So that's why Purdue could be a complex team to monitor in the coming weeks. Then let's talk about the team that just beat them, the Michigan Wolverines. One of my favorite duos to watch in college basketball, Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden. We're going to talk about Danny Wolf a little bit later in the show, but he is a chameleon. He can play two different positions in terms of the guard and the forward position and dominate you during both. He's an elite passer. He's an elite finisher. There are questions about his ability to score from the free throw line and his defense, but when he gets going, he's an elite player, and Vlad Golden complements him beautifully. They could be a tough out, but outside of those two guys, they have the depth necessary, right, to make a big run. Because having elite big men is a special thing in college basketball, but I don't know if it's enough for this Michigan Wolverines team. Then let's talk about the Illinois Fighting Illini. This is a very interesting team in my opinion. They have a tough test, I believe, in a couple weeks' time against Duke at the Garden. They have several lottery picks to look out for, but ultimately, I feel like when you're relying on freshmen to carry you, if you're Illinois, that's dangerous, because this Illinois team last year was one of the most experienced teams in college basketball. Now it's one of the most raw. And of course they brought in transfers to try and supplement it, but I feel like Illinois is starting to lose their luster in my mind a little bit. I love both Will Riley and Kaspars Giacochonis, but it's going to be difficult for them going up against fellow freshmen who I feel are a little bit more elite than them down the line in the NCAA tournament. But we'll see, right? Their first big test in the regular season is against Duke. If they play well there, then chances are my mind changes about this Illinois team. But for now, I highly doubt that a team led by two elite yet not necessarily lackluster, but not necessarily the greatness of a Cooper Flagg and, say, a Con Kneppel on Duke, or even an Igor Demine on a BYU. Those kinds of players, I need to be convinced by Giacochonis and Riley, and I don't know it from there yet. Then Maryland, UCLA, and Oregon, they're all in a very similar boat. Very balanced teams, and I think health more than anything matters for them. UCLA had a couple of injury woes early on in the season, and Mick Cronin is talking about how a lot of these players need to perform even when their fellow players have gone down. So I don't necessarily know about that. Both Maryland and Oregon aren't necessarily as convincing as they would be to me in prior years. So I really think that if you're looking at the Big Ten as a conference that could potentially produce a championship contender, it's going to have to come with the experienced teams like the Purdues and the Michigans of the world, and potentially Wisconsin Badgers team. They've lost a lot of talent, but I like a guy like Max Klesmit and John Tonye to lead this team in the NCAA tournament. So I think experience is going to be what carries this Big Ten conference in the NCAA tournament, and it's their best chance of producing a championship contender. Now let's go down the line here and talk about some of the teams on the bubble, but most likely should be in. Let's talk about this Ohio State Buckeyes team who have a very important game against Michigan. Definitely not as big in terms of college football rivalry, but still could potentially see them vault into lock territory. But this Buckeyes team I really like. But let's look at the 10 losses here. They do have 10 losses, but it's against a tough schedule. They're 4-9 against BPI top 50 opponents, but the remaining schedule could help them a little bit with Michigan and Indiana, a fellow bubble team potentially to come. But I do think that this Ohio State Buckeyes team falls into the individual player category. Bruce Thornton is their bell cow. I really like him, but I don't necessarily know if there's enough depth outside of that to carry them. Maybe Aaron Bradshaw down low steps up, but I don't necessarily know if this Ohio State team, like some other teams already in lock territory like Maryland, Oregon, and UCLA, can go deep in this tournament. So Ohio State's a big question mark to me if they vault into lock territory with a couple big wins down the stretch. And then a Nebraska team that has a top 40 ranking in terms of strength of record and wins above the bubble. They're at 78% currently on the ESPN forecast to make the tournament. I feel like this team just needs to play above its standard, right? This is a team that I feel has the talent to go far in this tournament, but they just come up a little bit short against the elite teams in their conference. They had a chance against Michigan at home, came up a bit short. They were currently on a 6-game losing streak, then they went on a 4-game heater. That hot and cold nature of their play kind of worries me. They do have talented players. They have Umar Ballo down low. Malik Reneau is a fascinating forward. Mackenzie Mbako can get going at any time. So this Indiana Hoosiers team really is a team that can rev up its engines, but also slow down a little bit. And so I feel like this Indiana team is definitely going to have to start convincing people and pundits and analysts that it actually can compete in a loaded Big Ten. But they still control their own destiny here. And outside of Purdue, they don't really have that tough of a schedule. They close the season, like I said, with Ohio State. So we'll see if Indiana can convince enough to potentially get out of the bubble range and into more of the lock territory. Then let's talk about the disappointing teams here. Let's talk about the Penn State Nittany Lions, and more importantly, my father's own Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Let's start off with the Penn State Nittany Lions. This is a team led by Ace Baldwin, who a lot of people were expecting to have a lot of hype surrounding them this season, but have not produced and have kind of fallen down the rankings almost all the way outside of even the bubble picture. At the very least, Rutgers has the pedigree, potentially in my mind, to be a bid stealer in this conference just because of the two players in Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey who can lead this team at any given moment. But Penn State, man, they just have fallen from grace. But now let's talk about this Rutgers Scarlet Knights team, because it did not come together like a lot of Rutgers fans would have liked it to, even though Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey have been just as good as advertised. I think a lot of people could blame the fact that Dylan Harper has fallen ill very often this season, and Ace Bailey himself has had to deal with a couple injury worries and concerns, but I just think that it's the depth around them that's lacking. Jordan Durkak and Lathan Somerville aren't necessarily the kind of players, as Tap to Learn also agrees that both of these elite freshmen have missed too much time, that can't necessarily supplement these two talented stars. And if these stars are, like Tap to Learn has said, miss too much time, there's no cohesion in this roster either. So that's what has failed Rutgers at the biggest time. But their saving grace could be the conference tournament, because that's the only way I can see any quote-unquote bid stealer coming from a very loaded conference at the top. So let me know what you think about the Big Ten Conference. Let me know what you think with some of the failures and disappointments in the Big Ten this season, especially teams like Penn State and Rutgers. But coming next, we transition more into talk about the players in some of these elite teams and how their draft stock has risen over the past couple of months, but also how it could plummet come the postseason as well. We'll be right back after this short break to discuss it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we're going to be talking about some of the players on these teams we talked about in all our Bubble Watch segments who have seen their draft stock rise, but could potentially also see it plummet in the coming months as their teams enter the NCAA tournament. I've chosen 3 guys to really keep your eye on, especially if you're looking at some of these players for your respective teams in terms of how they draft plan in March Madness. But for now, these players over the past couple of weeks have earned my respect and can potentially go even higher than what they're already projected to go in this year's draft. But it all depends on how they perform in the tournament. So without further ado, let me talk about each and every single one of these guys for you, starting off with my favorite chameleon. We just talked about him in the Big Ten Bubble Watch for the Michigan Wolverines, Mr. Danny Wolf. This is perhaps one of the most versatile big men out there right now in terms of NBA draft prospects. We're going to talk about another big man, but in my opinion, a big man who can stretch the floor and play multiple positions is just as dangerous as the next guy we're going to talk about, even though I think that the next guy we're going to talk about is a little bit better defensively than Danny Wolf. But he is a main reason that Michigan is at a 5-0 conference record, top 10 in KenPom, and really are going to be a tough out once March Madness rolls around. Because here's the thing. Danny Wolf, with his height alone, could profile as a great center. But he's not just that. He can play the point guard position. He's an elite perimeter shooter. He loves his bag of tricks, especially in the pick and roll game. And he loves to pass the basketball as well. So everything NBA teams like in an elite center, right? I think the only caveat here is 2 things. The fact that he kind of plays positionless basketball. He hasn't necessarily played at the point guard position as much as of late, but it's still going to be a confusing factor to follow for a lot of these NBA teams because of that versatility. They may not necessarily know how to classify him. And then he kind of lacks a little bit more on the defensive end than you would like. And he's also not necessarily the best of free throw shooters for how much he drives the basket. But the elite traits, he plays so well off the ball. He throws in 3-pointers. Like I said, he's an elite passer. And he understands the game of basketball with a high offensive IQ on that side of things. But I do think what NBA scouts are going to monitor, especially in the tournament, if they go up against a team that can challenge him on defense, is how he responds and also how this Michigan team utilizes him going forward, because he is a very vulnerable player. And he's going to prove it in terms of his motor each and every single game. It's undeniable. This guy loves playing the game of basketball. And you can see it a lot in his game. But what NBA scouts are going to be looking for is how he finishes his career as a Michigan Wolverine. If he can lead this team, like I mentioned, on a deep run in the tournament, it's because of his improvement as a defensive player, as a player who doesn't necessarily let his versatility get the better of him sometimes, then I could potentially see him vaulting into, say, top 10 to 15 status in this year's NBA draft. He's that good and he's that elite due to his height and his high motor. But if he fails to impress against teams that can impact him down low and against big men who want to get a little bit more physical on the defensive side of the court, then that's where I start to worry about his potential a little bit. But overall, a very elite offensive player who at 7'1" has a bag of tricks that is undeniable and incredible to watch, especially when paired with Vlad Golden, because they are two fascinating big men when they play well offensively. But it's got to come down, like I always say, to how he performs when it matters. But that's why Wolf can be a potential draft riser, and why right now he's viewed so highly in NBA circles. Now let's talk about another big man who I feel is the more complete two-way player, is the younger of the two, so maybe a little bit more raw in that regard, but still a fascinating project, and really is going to have a big spotlight on him come NCAA tournament time, and that is Alex Condon. I decided to skip ahead to him because Chaz Lanier is a guard, and it's a completely different profile, so I wanted to kind of stick in the big man territory for just a little while longer. And the reason why I really like Alex Condon out of Australia is because he's going to play in games that matter, because this Florida team excels when he is on the court and even when he's off the court, and he forms an elite inside-outside duo with Walter Clayton Jr. And I was a little bit worried about Florida's center depth this season because of the loss of Micah Hanlockton due to that serious leg injury that he sustained last year. But him and Thomas Ha have more than held their own this season. And as a young guy, still a sophomore, who has shown elite abilities on both sides of the court, really is exciting to watch if I'm an NBA team. Especially because you can view him as more of a project. If you're, say, a team like the Thunder who has a lot of draft capital and are thinking about adding yet another big man to an already stacked big man rotation. And either you're a team like the Rockets, who as well as the Thunder have elite draft capital as well, Alex Condon is the perfect project for you. I feel that Danny Wolf is going to be more viewed closely because he's the more experienced player, but Alex Condon has the higher ceiling, in my opinion. The sky is the limit truly for this kid. He's an elite shooter on the outside. He does have to improve around the rim, but I don't necessarily have many concerns with him defensively. I feel like he's a very elite defensive player in terms of switching, in terms of dropping coverage, and he's really good at using his body, using his feet especially, to switch, to make those drops in certain situations. And I feel like that side of his game is really going to pique a lot of NBA teams' interest, because chances are you don't see a big man this elite defensively so early in his college career. But I do think the one issue with him is that even though he has a deep bag offensively, I do think that he isn't as polished right now as you would like him. He needs to fill out his frame for one, and I do think that only shooting 51% on two-pointers as a big man is detrimental right now to his development. But I do feel that unlike Danny Wolf, there's a better chance to improve because Florida is a deeper team, in my opinion, than Michigan, and they have a better chance of going further. So as they go further, Alex Condon has a chance to face more big men, much like who will be facing in the NBA, who can challenge him to elevate his game. That's what I like about this, because comparing these two guys, you would say that Danny Wolf is the more chameleonic player who can fill a lot more shoes for you. But Alex Condon, if I'm a team picking in the middle of the draft, whether I'm an elite team right now who are opening their championship window like the Thunder or Rockets, or even a team like the Nets who just want as many developmental pieces as possible, I'm really intrigued by a guy of Alex Condon's caliber because of how young he is. And that's what's special about this guy. Because you are not necessarily going to see a lot of big men as elite defensively as Condon in the NCAA tournament, I believe. I feel like a lot of big men are going to use that platform to attack offensively, use their physicality to overwhelm teams. But Alex Condon, because of his understanding at this age, really has a chance to elevate his game, not just defensively, where he's already elite, but offensively as well, because he knows the ceiling of this Florida team, and he knows his own ceiling as an NBA prospect. So that's what really excites me. I wish him the best of luck in the NCAA tournament, and I really hope that a lot of NBA scouts are going to be monitoring him, because the sky's the limit for this kid, in my opinion. Now let's talk about the only guard that I'm really excited and intrigued to see in the NCAA tournament as more of a project as well, in Chaz Lanier. This guy had to fill big shoes after Dalton Knecht went to the NBA, because Tennessee's a team, right, that's going to beat you defensively. They're very sound schematically there. But with guys that can unlock your perimeter shooting, you can have a big chance of advancing in the NCAA tournament. And that's what Tennessee did last with Knecht, and what they potentially do this year with Chaz Lanier. And in my opinion, when you compare both of them, I do actually think there's a chance for Chaz Lanier to become a little bit more elite than even Knecht. And right now, he's averaging 19 points per game, 43.7% from 3 on 8.4 attempts. So he's already kind of at the threshold of where Knecht profiled at Tennessee last year. He's a great catch and shoot guy. He loves to release the ball quickly. And I feel like his versatility at the position could see him play off guards a little bit more, because he's not necessarily seen as out-and-out shooting guard, in my opinion. Because of his height, he can play multiple positions, and he can play off guards very well. But the one thing that a lot of teams are going to monitor with him is how complete he can become. Because it's fine and dandy to be a great shooter, and NBA teams love great shooters. It's becoming the norm here. If you shoot the three, you win in the NBA. But Chaz Lanier is a little bit too selfish. And for a Tennessee team that finally wants to break through to at the very least the Final Four, you can't be a selfish player. You're going to have to spread the wealth. He's only averaging 1.2 assists per game. So you might want to see a little bit more of that from Chaz Lanier instead of, just being the catch and shoot player on this squad. But I do think because of his elite shooting ability, it does open up a lot more avenues for him in this team. But how it translates to the NBA is a different question. We're already seeing how Dalton Knecht can be utilized as a Los Angeles Laker, and how that went in terms of the trade the failed trade that ensued for his services in Charlotte. But Chaz Lanier, at the very least, has the team and has the culture around him to make him a more well-rounded player than where he is right now. And Tennessee has his best shot in quite some time to advance to a spot in the tournament they'll be very happy with. So all these three players I'm really excited to see. The only guard that I mentioned, Chaz Lanier, in terms of how he pans out. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because coming up to conclude today's show, we transition to the world of baseball, talking about the top 5 MLB prospects to look out for this season, right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our final segment of today's show, we transition to the world of baseball, talking about the top 5 MLB prospects to look out for in 2025. Well, maybe not for some of these guys because some are a little bit more raw than others in this top 5, and potentially their farm systems are a little bit too loaded to really differentiate who to call up when. But I do think that these are some of the guys, when you look at some of these loaded farm systems, you could expect to see in the next 2 years be called up and play significant minutes. Well, actually, I don't know why I made a basketball reference there. Or get significant time in the majors over the next couple of years. So without further ado, let's just jump right into them. Really exciting list. Really excited to present these players to you to monitor. If you're a fan of any of these teams, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you think about these guys and how they profile in terms of when they'll get called up. But let's just jump right into it. Starting off at number 5, perhaps the rawest prospect on this list, Carson Williams of the Tampa Bay Rays at the shortstop position. And early comps, he's looking kind of like an early career Trevor Story and a later career Dansby Swanson, if you can picture that at the shortstop position. But the reason why I call him a little bit more raw than some of the other guys you'll see on this list is because there's a lot of swing and miss in his game, and now he's become more of a power over hit guy. But he does profile at an elite level defensively at the very least, and I feel like in a Rays team that does invest a little bit more in homegrown talent than others, and most importantly, invest in them not just necessarily as elite players, but certainly as utility players as well. That's where we could see Carson Williams really shine, when he's out there in the field as a utility guy. Not necessarily always staying in the lineup at any given moment, just, getting in there potentially to get you a couple of hits, but potentially to shore up defensively as well. So I do feel like he's an interesting prospect to look out considering how the Rays use a lot of their talent, but I would expect him to hover around the AAA ranks for another year or so because there's a lot of depth for the Rays at the position with Taylor Walls and Jose Caballero, so I wouldn't expect to see his face this year specifically. But he is an interesting player to get to know. Also could have profiled as a pitcher. He sat in the mid-90s of the mound for quite some time, coming from the 2021 MLB draft class. I feel like, though, because of his abilities as a defensive shortstop, he added more muscle, gained more power, and tried to add a little bit more hitting to his game. So we're going to see how it all translates, putting that power over hit potential to the test and also combining it with the plus defending. So it all makes for a very interesting player, but I don't necessarily know what the timeline is for him just yet because of how deep the Rays look in terms of their farm system, especially in an AL East known for producing a lot of young talent through their farm systems, because this is not the only AL East prospect on this list. So that's all you should know about the AL East there, but Carson Williams, fascinating prospect in terms of his potential. Then at number 4, this is another exciting AL East guy here in Marcelo Meyer, another shortstop here, and his ESPN comp is a lankier lefty Willy Adames if it all clicks, and I could see it. He's gonna hit more for average than, say, a Carson Williams, and I feel like he is also someone who can profile as an elite defensive prospect as well. But I do feel like in terms of actually putting that power to use, Meyer profiles a little bit better than Williams. And so I do feel like in terms of his timeline, we could see him on the field as soon as this season rather than Carson Williams' projected timeline, just because of his steady improvements. For example, his chase rate was down 3%, his swing rate was down 3%, and his exit velos have been just steadily going up, which is always a good sign that you want to see from these talented prospects. But I do feel like, in terms of as to the reason why he's ranked a little bit more highly than a Carson Williams, is because of that timeline. And he also grades a little bit better, I believe, than Williams in terms of defending at the position. He's very rangy, very flashy, he has elite arm strength, and most importantly, I feel like the power that we see from him can produce home runs rather than Carson Williams' power, which is more so hitting for average. So that's why I feel Marcelo Mayer ranks a little bit more highly right now than Carson Williams, and has a faster timeline attached to him than Carson Williams as well. I'm really excited to see him. He could have been a little bit higher on the list, but with the talent in the Red Sox farm system, you would have to think that because of that, a lot of people find it hard to grade these guys and try and rank them as a result as well. So that could potentially be why such a talented player is sitting at number 4 on this list. But let's get into who is number 3. A Minnesota Twin here in Walker Jenkins, who's an interesting prospect, the first right fielder, first outfielder on this list. ESPN comps kind of like J.D. Drew. And this is a guy who's going to be a smooth hitter, very athletic feel for the position. He is going to really pop in terms of how his power translates to the field, rather than say, always hitting home runs. I feel like the reason why he's ahead of Meyer is because he's a little bit more well-rounded. He can get you not just home runs, but hits, and play the level that you want him to in the outfield as well. And I feel like his big selling point is as a hitter because of his bat skills, and I feel like he's going to be in the Meyer range in terms of home runs, but I feel like the way he plays the game offensively, combined with his power, is interesting to watch, because he's the only one where scouts are saying he's a fantastic runner, instinctual on the pace paths, and his versatility really pops out to a lot of teams. He can likely move around in the infield, not just seen as a right fielder, and I feel like when you look at the 2 players before him, they're confined to the shortstop position a little bit more than a guy like Walker Jenkins. So it's this wide range that makes Walker Jenkins very appealing. In terms of his kind of timeline, a lot of people are saying that this is a guy who in many different drafts would have been the top overall pick and could have a fast-tracked path to the major leagues and be the top prospect in baseball in the next 12 months. So, not necessarily, at the level of Marcelo Meyer in terms of making the big leagues, but still someone who is definitely going to appeal to a lot of people in the Twins fan base as a very smooth, level-headed player with high upside athleticism, both offensively and defensively. And most importantly, more versatility than the 2 players who preceded him on this list. So it's going to be interesting to see how he pans out. But let's get into our second Red Sox prospect on this list, in Roman Anthony. And this is a guy who can be volatile in terms of how we comp him compared to Colton Cowser or Kyle Tucker, no matter what you see in this game. But I feel that the 2 prospects from the Red Sox on this list are all about power. And I don't mind that, but it's quite telling when you are seen as a prolific hitter and not necessarily the best at your position defensively. And that's kind of what I want to see a little bit more out of from these two guys. But Roman Anthony is still a fascinating prospect because he projects as someone who, as a lefty, can hit with a lot of power, can get over the 30-plus range in terms of home runs, and ultimately can fast-track his path to the majors. I feel like he can play many different positions in the outfield as well, so his versatility rivals that of Jenkins behind him. And I just feel that the reason why people might be more compelled to look at him a little bit ahead of a guy like Jenkins is because of the power. It's not necessarily a big selling point in my personal opinion, but I do think that it's big if you're, say, projecting him for the next 5 to 10 years. And because of his fast track, I do think that he has potential to make it to the major leagues ahead of a guy like Jenkins, who they're still saying could be the top prospect within the next 12 months, which means that he would still be in the minor leagues instead of, where Roman Anthony could be in the next couple of games. But that's what this league is becoming, right? A power-friendly league. And that's what basically Roman Anthony is all about. But I don't necessarily think he's better than perhaps the most versatile prospect of all time, who should not necessarily be on this list, but is because of his prowess. Roki Sasaki. And we'll be very brief about him because we talked about him all offseason. But technically, he is an international amateur. That's how the Dodgers signed him, because of when he made himself available. So technically, if the Dodgers see fit to put him in the minor leagues, why wouldn't they? To improve his game. He already has plus splitters and sliders, and a lot of people could say that he could beat MLB teams with that stuff alone. But if you view him as a prospect, then that could mean that the Dodgers saw that he could make adjustments to his game as they see fit. He still doesn't necessarily have the best of velocity. In fact, that has regressed the mean for him. So that could be something the Dodgers look into. But overall, if you view him as a prospect, he is projected to be the number one overall prospect. That will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show. We'll be back here tomorrow to conclude the week. See y'all then.